great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Brenda Wahler is a fourth-generation Montanan who is an attorney, writer, and independent historian here in Helena. Marcus Daly's Road to Montana is her second book. She also authored Montana Horse Racing, A History, which is where she discovered the impact of Marcus Daly and was inspired to dig deeper into the story of the Copper King. So please help me welcome Brenda Wahler.
All right, thank you very much. And I believe there's no live mic here, so first of all, I just would like to thank the Montana Historical Society because they have done a wonderful job of putting together this entire series, and they were also tremendously supportive of my research during what turned out to be a 3-year process to bring Marcus Daly's first part of his story to print. So with that, the mystery of who Marcus Daly was, everybody thinks they know who he was. And yet, when I started to work on a book which was going to be about his racehorses, I discovered nothing. And there were stories here, stories there, myths and legends. And so I began to unearth his biography. And by the time I got him to the Rocky Mountain West, I was 40,000 words into a 50,000 word count limit on my book, and I had to give my publisher a call and say, Artie, what are we going to do? And we decided that we'll be doing 2 books. And so this time we're going to be talking about Marcus Daly's Road to Montana. Now, he's most closely associated with Butte and the copper that quite literally electrified the United States. But he also built the town of Anaconda, he built the town of Hamilton, he caused a bit of consternation here in Helena because he wasn't entirely sure we should have the state capital here. And he had an impact across the entire state that we still see echoes of today. The myth of Daly that got him a statue that was originally, this is, let's see if I can make the pointer work. Oh, pointer doesn't work. The statue that you see here is now at the entrance to Montana Tech in Butte, but originally it was on North Main Street. And this was when it was unveiled in 1907. And so the statue kind of marked the beginnings of the Marcus Daly myth, because even in his lifetime, he was very secretive. He hid in plain sight. He'd come up, he'd shake your hand, he'd talk to you about your wife, your kids, your husband, whatever, but yet he kind of kept what he was up to very, very quiet. And when he died in 1900, it was said that more than one rail car went to Hamilton, where he had his stock farm, filled with boxes and boxes and boxes of records from the Anaconda Company. And his widow, Margaret, tasked one of her ranchman hands with shoveling them all into a stove. And so almost all records that Daly created were burned after his death. We can thank our lucky stars for the pack rats, one of whom was Samuel Hauser, whose papers are at the Historical Society archives. He kept everything, including some letters from Daly, where Daly concluded the letter saying, oh, by the way, burn this when you finish reading it. And so we have a few records left. A lot of people wrote stories of Marcus Daly. They tended to be Marcus Daly the hero or Marcus Daly the villain, and often were tales of the old-timers who worked for Mr. Daly. And so as such, there wasn't a lot of critical analysis of his life. What we know for certain is that he was born in Ireland. And he was extremely proud of his Irish heritage throughout his life. That was a very big part of who he was. How many folks here do have Irish heritage? All right, great, quite a few. So if you are at all familiar with Ireland, the Dalys were originally Clan Daly, and it is believed that they were originally kind of came to fame in Westmeath, down in kind of the central part of the country, where they probably, at least some members of the clan, were chieftains, were leaders. To what degree, it's hard to say, and of course, when you start getting people talking about their ancestry, everybody is descended from the Lost Pharaoh and the princess of whatever, so it's a little hard to know how important the Dalys were. But there was some genealogical research that said Clan Daly were chieftains in Westmeath, also bards and poets, and so we know where Daly got his gift of gab. During the reign of the reign, so to speak, of Oliver Cromwell, who was, of course, caused a lot of trouble both in England and in Ireland. Anybody who disagreed with Cromwell did not do terribly well, and Clan Daly broke up and scattered in every possible direction, including to County Cavan. And so that's where we get to Marcus Daly's own family. The one advantage for people who moved into Ulster Province, and Cavan is part of Ulster Province historically, but it's one of the 3 Ulster counties that's still in the Republic of Ireland today. If you were in Ulster, you had a few more land protections as a tenant farmer than in some other parts of the country. It was said that the tenant right of Ulster meant you could stay on your land as long as you paid your rent, as opposed to other parts of the country where even if you paid your rent, they could kick you off anyway. Cavan was a beautiful place, and Daly's family, they were probably tenant farmers. And if you want to get a sense of what Cavan was like, it was even memorialized in song. It has been said that Marcus Daly is the 2nd most famous person from Ballyjames Duff, and the most famous person was Paddy Riley, who is the topic of this song.
The Garden of Eden has vanished, they say, but I know the lie of it still. Just turn to the left at the bridge of Finney and stop when halfway to Butte Hill. 'Tis there you will find it, I know sure enough, when fortune has come to my call. The grass it grows green around Ballyjames stuff, and the blue sky is over it all.
I cut that off kind of quickly so we don't go on. There's about 6 verses to that. But the Daly family were probably tenant farmers. There's a lot of debates over if they were completely dirt poor or only as poor as every other Irish Catholic in Ireland. Local County Cavan historians, sometimes people from Montana do take tours and they go to Ireland, and there was one that was a County Cavan tour. And the local historians love to tool around tourists from Montana and tell you about your ancestors. They claim the Daly family was relatively comfortable, that they had a nice farmhouse with an orchard and a garden and some nice things like that. What I thought was also interesting is when I was communicating with some folks in Ireland who understand the history, they provided me this photograph of what's called Mount Nugent Bridge. And when I looked into the history of the village of Mount Nugent, it used to be called, once upon a time, Daly's Bridge, which is kind of an interesting thing. So again, you know, this was a family that they certainly weren't the lowest of the low, and they seem to have had some respect in the area. Daly's mother is buried in the graveyard in, they call it Crushly Parish in that part of Ireland. His father was Luke Daly. He pops up in a land valuation in 1856. In 1857, there was also a son named Luke Daly, and possibly our Marcus Daly's grandfather was named Luke Daly. You need to know that anybody who is not Irish, I'm going to let you know that Irish didn't have very many names, I guess, because they recycled them over and over again, which really makes research fun because you're like, which one? But the Luke Dalys that lived in Daly area had a large enough acreage. One of them had about 25 acres, one of them had 40. And for Ireland, that's a lot of land. So they were probably local leaders. Their home may have been a gathering place where people would come and visit if you didn't know what else you were going to do. Let's go over to the Dalys, let's bring let's bring some musical instruments, let's bring a newspaper, let's talk about what's going on in the world. The term they sometimes used for these people were strong farmers, and that kind of meant that they were local leaders. Now, the fun stuff is when you get into one of the more entertaining biographies of Marcus Daly, which was written by a guy named Hugh Daly. And some people call him Cousin Hugh. We don't know if he was anything close to a first or a second or a third cousin, but he was a Daly. And Cousin Hugh and Marcus didn't know each other in Butte. And Hugh Daly wrote a biography of Marcus Daly after he died. It was authorized by Margaret the widow, and it gilds the lily quite a bit. He was he just loved Marcus. But every now and then he would let something real specific slip. And from that you get the impression that that part was probably true. One of the things he said was that the family had more than a local reputation as horse trainers. And whether that was before the famine, or after the famine, or even during the famine, it's hard to say. But I put a picture of an Irish cob up here because if the Dalys had horses on their own property, they were probably work horses or some kind of a common everyday animal. If they worked with thoroughbreds, and Daly, of course, winds up owning racehorses, that would have been a situation where they would have worked for somebody else, because for the most part, the Irish did not own the fine blood horses. The other thing that Hugh Daly said about the family was that they had a connection to the Young Ireland movement. And the Young Ireland movement is particularly noted for one of its most famous leaders. I don't know if anybody recognizes the statue, but Thomas Francis Marr, our former territorial governor, was the leader of the Young Ireland movement. He is known for being the person who introduced the Irish tricolor flag to the world. He's the one who had the great public image. He's the one who got arrested, charged with sedition, sent off to Australia in lieu of hanging, exiled to Tasmania, escaped, came to America, wound up in New York. The rest of the Marcus Daly story and the correlation with Thomas Francis Marr is that when that statue was being commissioned, the Thomas Francis Marr Memorial Society was formed in 1898. Guess who the president was? Marcus Daly. And so Daly, I also think that it was an interesting thing because, of course, the capital fight that made Helena the capital of Montana was more or less won by W.A. Clark, who backed Helena. But Daly made sure that the territory in front of the capital was marked by Thomas Francis Marr. And we still fly the flag of Ireland in front of the capital every day on St. Patty's. So that's kind of fun. Back in Ireland, Daly also sent money not only to his family, but he donated the funds for this, what they call a Sabbat Mater, or a Calvary, which is a life-size statue that is in St. Mary's Church in Crushly Parish. And it's kind of a fun thing because if you look at the plaque, which is kind of hard to read here, it reads that it's presented by the Honorable Marcus Daly, Gold Mines, Montana, America. Okay? 1894. But Daly never forgot where he came from. And this was the church near the graveyard where his mother was buried. His family tree is pretty complicated. I will not go over this chart in great detail except to say that it is in my book if you wish to study it. But the thing we know is that Daly came from a family of 11 children, and I managed to figure out all 11 of them. The oldest was Anna Daly, married John O'Farrell. She also came to America ahead of everybody else. She's kind of the groundbreaker who got over here, sent the remittances back home, began to bring the rest of the family over as they could come. The obituary said she got to America in 1851, but the 1850 census for Connecticut, for I think it was New Haven, does show an 18-year-old Ann Daly in a boarding house of other single women. So, you know, Ann Daly is a common name. It could not necessarily be the right one, but we have the right name, the right place, the right age, and the right occupation. So there's a pretty good chance that she was here by about 1850. She and her husband then moved to California. And again, census data is usually our friend, except Martha and I were talking about how sometimes it's not always legible, it's not always accurate, but it's a pretty close guess. But in 1860, they pop up in the census for Auburn, California, and they are the parents of a son named Charles, who was said to have been born in 1858 in California. So our best guess is that they came west somewhere between 1856 and 1858. They later pop up in the census for Virginia City, Nevada in 1870 and 1880. They eventually began to follow Marcus Daly rather than Marcus Daly following them. And then sometime after 1880, they wind up in Montana. I know for sure they were here by 1886. I'm not sure if they got here a little earlier. They were the proxies for Marcus Daly when he bought a homestead over in Hamilton, the Anthony Chafin homestead, that was the foundation of the Bitterroot stock farm over there. It was kind of a sad story. The O'Farrells, 3 of their children, predeceased Anna, and she herself died relatively young in 1897. This is the gravestone in Butte, and the first of they lost one child in Virginia City, but then John O'Farrell Jr., this is an image of him that's next to the angel in this graveyard. He was the first to pass on. I think he died of typhoid. And Marcus Daly just loved his nephew. This young man was virtually his son. And you can see that in the headstone, just how much he gave that young man honor. Anna died of Bright's disease, which was the same condition that killed Marcus Daly himself. That's a description for a set of symptoms, basically kidney failure, heart disease, combined. Probably that describes type 2 diabetes in the days before insulin. That's our best guess. So that was Anna. She made it to Butte. The next sibling that made it to Butte was a younger brother named Patrick Daly. He eventually became a Montana state senator. He served in the 1909 session. Same year he had a heart attack and died rather suddenly. We don't know for sure when he was born because his headstone says he was born in 1856. And again, he also was buried in Butte. But there's baptism records at Creshley Parish that have Patrick Daly born on St. Patrick's Day, which was kind of fun. But he was born to Luke and Mary Coyle Daly in 1845. So either he was fudging his birthday by 11 years, or else somebody else was fudging it by 11 years, or there may have been more than one child and they recycled the name, so I don't know the answer for sure. But Patrick Daly was another Montana Daly who made an impact. And then the final sibling that wound up in Montana was Kate Rudden, and she was widowed. Her husband, I cannot find anything on him. He's just sort of vanishes, except they mentioned he was with her at the statue dedication in 1907, but he was dead by 1909. She was very close to her brother. The fun story about Kate Rudden is that she died in Anaconda, And she was ticked at the relatives, especially the ones back in Ireland that she felt were ungrateful, and so she left. She had a small estate. It wasn't that small, she had about $50,000, which back in those days was quite a bit of money. But she left $1 to each of her relatives, and all the rest of it went to the church in Anaconda. Now, the other problem is that this triggered a probate fight because she had rewritten her will kind of at the beginning of her final illness, and the person who helped her rewrite her will and helped her sign it and witnessed it was her parish priest. So that was just, and so we have it. The good news, though, is that the family contested the will, which, by the way, the church won. The will was upheld. But thanks to that probate file, we have a record of all the Dalys that were still living and some of the ones that had died recently and where they were and why they were ungrateful and so on and so forth. So it was quite delightful. She did give Daly's second oldest daughter, Molly Gerard, about $1,000, and that was kind of ironic because Molly married into some serious money. Anybody who didn't really need money, it was Molly. But apparently Molly was the kind and wonderful relative who still came to visit her and helped look after her in her final illness, so Molly got a little more money. Now, Daly had 3 more siblings that made it to America, and they all settled on the East Coast, and these were the ones that were harder to dig up. The most fascinating one was a guy named Thomas Daly, who settled in New Jersey, and one of his sons was named Marcus Daly. And Marcus Daly nephew actually had some political appointments during the Eisenhower administration. He was a fairly controversial figure in his local community. He also owned racehorses and was important enough in the area that he actually had an obituary in the New York Times. So it's hard to say about Brother Thomas. It's interesting because the census does have a Thomas Daly in Butte in 1880, but they list him as the head of the household, husband of Margaret, father of Hattie and Mattie, which is like, no, that's Marcus Daly they're talking about, and they put his job as mill superintendent. But I kind of wonder if maybe perhaps Brother Thomas was living in Butte right at that time and maybe living in the same household. You know, that's what you might do with your bachelor uncle. And then the census taker was just confused with the names and didn't put down both Marcus and Thomas. I have no idea. On the other hand, there was also a Thomas Daly that would pop up in the city directory in other contexts. Might be 2 totally different people and not related at all, but it's a mystery. If somebody ever wants to dig into the Thomas Daly family, there's some great mysteries to be solved. They also had a sister named Mary. They lost track of her, but she popped up after Daly died, wanting a share of the fortune, which is one reason why Kate Redden gave her $1. And then Owen Daly, he didn't even get $1. I think they lost track of him completely. But his descendants are alive today, and they have done some extensive genealogical research and have identified Owen as a sibling, and one of the family members has even come out to Montana and done some fairly extensive research. They were very helpful to me also in locating the names of a number of other siblings, including Thomas. 4 more siblings stayed in Ireland. The oldest was James. We find some census data on him. He married. He pops up in the 1901 census. They mention him in Patrick Daly's obituary in 1909, but they don't mention him in Kate Redden's will, so he died somewhere in there, but we don't know when. There was also a Luke Jr., or perhaps Luke III or Luke IV, I'm not sure, but Daly had a brother named Luke as well as his father. We have some pretty good records on him, including a probate record from County Cavan. And then the other thing that folks in Ireland helped me find was Daly also had a brother named Peter who died fairly young and is also buried in the same graveyard as Mary Boyle Daly. So that's what we know. And then we have Honor, who apparently was the family radical. She never married, she never had children. She pops up living with her brother Luke and her brother James in the various census. It was said that she built a very nice house with the remittances that Marcus Daly sent to Ireland. And I think the photo archives here have a picture of that house. It's either here or it's in Butte, and I saw the picture once, didn't write down its number and its location, and now I can't find it. But she did have a very fine little farmhouse that she apparently allowed members of the Irish Republican Army to hang out there as a hideout, because in 1921, the Black and Tan paramilitary organization burned down the house. So they honor Daly. She's kind of the fun relative that we all know. We have one of those. When Daly came to America in 1856, he landed in New York City. This round building down here is called Castle Garden. This was the Immigrant Processing Center. It was the predecessor to Ellis Island. So that's probably where he went through. Unfortunately, there was subsequently a fire that destroyed all the records from Castle Garden and some of the earliest records from Ellis Island, and so that we kind of dead end there. We have a pretty good guess that he was probably 14 when he got on the ship. Everybody says he comes to America about 1856. Most of the books you read say, oh, he was 15 in 1856. I've got a December birthday. I know how this works. He had a December birthday. You're probably not on the ship from Ireland in December. Most of the immigrant ships came in April, May, June. And so he was probably 14 when he actually came over. Various biographies, they say that he may have been a dock worker, a newsboy, telegram runner, all kinds of different things. And my guess is that he was a charming adult with withering sarcasm and a smart mouth. And when he was 14, he was probably also a charming young man with withering sarcasm and a smart mouth, which makes me suspect that when people say, which one of these jobs over the course of 5 years did he hold, my guess is all of them. And we think that Anna probably was in America by the time he got there, but she and John left for California within a couple of years, so there was a few years he was there on his own. If you were Irish in New York, one of the places you turned to for help was the Society of St. Tammany, better known as Tammany Hall. And the Tammany Hall political machine relied heavily on the Irish who became American citizens as a key voting constituency. They were the safety net for the poor in a time when there was no social safety net provided by the government. And when we look at Daly's life, he mimicked a lot of the Tammany Hall machine in how he addressed politics in Montana. Very generous, get a lot of votes for the people you support. In turn, you return your largesse to your voters. But you also see Dr. Freud has nothing on racehorse owners. This was Daly's stallion thoroughbred operation. 1900 calendar. His most famous and favorite racehorse was named Tammany. You have the barn. He names his stallion barn Tammany Hall. The calendar says it's Tammany Hall Stables. Tammany the stallion has offspring who are named things like Tammany Hall, and the leaders of Tammany Hall, they used Native American, they appropriated Native American culture. The leader of a Tammany Hall division was a Grand Sachem. That's the name of one of Tammany's offspring as well. So it's pretty obvious that Daly had good feelings about Tammany Hall. And then, of course, he's in New York City at the same time Thomas Francis Meagher was in New York City. Meagher was a lot older. It's pretty unlikely they would have actually met unless it was kind of like at a rock show where, oh, Thomas, Thomas. And there's Daly 14 or 15 going, there's my hero. These were years when New York had a lot of unrest. You've ever heard of the Dead Rabbits riot, you've heard of the Great Police Riot perhaps. A lot of tension between rich and poor. This, again, would have shaped Daly a great deal. And then, of course, Daly leaves New York in 1861 probably not a coincidence, that's the same year the Civil War begins. And so from there, he goes west. He takes a ship via the Isthmus of Panama. The way they used to do it back in those days, they had you'd take a ship to the east coast of Panama, then you get on a train or take some mules, go to the west coast, and then you take another ship up to California, so that's how he got there. In California, he called these his rough years that gave him a lot of common sense. He would have tried to mine gold for the most part, and the gold panning was playing out by the time he got there in 1861, so these are just images of how they would have handled the hard rock mining. The arrastras, they would have taken the gold ore and put it in this little flat area, hitch a mule to a arm and go around and around and around all day dragging these great big huge 300-pound boulders, and they just crush the ore. If they did have access to water, this is some of these long sluice boxes. We're all familiar with our little sluice box guys and the statue up the mall. That was a little bitty baby one. This is kind of more the things they tended to build. I think here in Montana, I don't know if anybody's a gold mining expert here, but I think that even the sluices in Montana sometimes are really, really long and elaborate. And they also would dump mercury in there to help separate out the gold, and just wash it wherever. So it was quite a process. The other fun thing, though, is of course, where did his sister live? Auburn, California. Guess who else lived in Auburn, California during the exact same set of years that Daly was there? We know he was Palm. Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau ran the Orleans Hotel in Auburn, which I'm pretty sure is this building in the center of the image, this two-story building with a balcony. And if you were a traveler and you're going through town, this is what Auburn looked like in that time period. And you would be stopping off, you need a room, you need a beverage, you want to listen to the proprietor tell you tall tales. I really think it's fascinating that Daly may have known the youngest member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. You never know. Just a coincidence, perhaps, and maybe they never met, but it's striking. Now, in California, the three men who later became Daly's partners in the Anaconda Copper Company already were there. George Hearst, James Ben Ali Hagen, and Lloyd Tevis. And Tevis and Hagen, by the way, were brothers-in-law, so they often tag-teamed each other. Quite famous. Tevis became president of Wells Fargo Bank. Hagen was usually vice president because he was the quiet guy that got everything done. Hearst was the mining expert, and he would travel all over the country looking for mining properties. His wife was Phoebe Apperson Hearst. They had one child. His name was William Randolph Hearst. And I like this baby picture. There's a legend that Daly met George Hearst in 1864 when Daly went to British Columbia to rescue him when he was lost. I don't think that happened. I think that's a myth. I do think that Daly may have met Hearst somewhere between 1864 and 1868. And it's also probably true, it's known that Hearst did go to British Columbia scouting mining properties, but I think the two stories got combined together. Daly had also said he was once at the head of a relief party, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. It's probably linked to an event in 1877. The Hearsts spend a little bit of time in Montana. They're here a few times. And of course, one of the most interesting things about the Hearst family is that in 1895, the Anaconda Company restructured, and Daly, Phoebe Hearst later wrote and said that she thought that Daly should wind up in the penitentiary, but somehow he talked her into selling Hearst's shares in the Anaconda, and as part of the whole thing, putting it public. She gets millions and millions of dollars. She gives her son William a small allowance, maybe 150 grand. He goes off and buys a newspaper. He'd already owned the San Francisco Examiner, which was his father's paper. This is his second one. So the Anaconda Company launched the Hearst newspaper empire, kind of indirectly. So that's just some other things. And also Phoebe Hearst, if you go to Anaconda, the Hearst Free Library, she founded that and gave it as a gift to the people of Anaconda. While we're in Anaconda, you might look to the skyline and you might notice a geographic feature called Mount Hagen. This is named for James Ben Ali Hagen, who we talk about in the book. He helped bankroll the Anaconda smelter. He's the one who believed in Daly even when Hearst was iffy and tenants thought Daly was out of his mind. Hagen's the one who took out his checkbook, signed every blank check in and handed it to Daly and said, draw as you need as long as I have a penny in the bank. So Daly helped arrange that eventually Mount Peak gets named after him. There's also a reservoir that is Lake Hearst, that is the water supply for the city of Anaconda. So Hearst gets a little bit of credit. Temis did not get anything named after him. Now Daly goes to Nevada somewhere between 1863 and 1865. His first boss on the Comstock Lode in the Virginia City, Nevada area was a guy named Bill Scarum. And Daly literally called him Scarum. He was a crusty fellow. He later comes to Butte when he's much older. Daly gives him a job sort of supervising safety at one of the mines. And one day, Daly is rich, he's famous, he's in his top hat, he's in a cigar, he's giving a tour to some wealthy investors. Scarum sees him and he says, Mr. Daly, you put out that cigar. So Scarum got away with everything. We find Daly in the 1870 census living in central Nevada, a place called Hamilton, Nevada, that it's kind of close to the present day town of Ely, Nevada. It's now a ghost town. The most important person Daly met in Nevada was John Mackey. He's one of the people who hit the big bonanza on the Comstock Lode after Daly left, but he was a mine manager and probably gave Daly some of his first leadership jobs. They were lifetime friends. Mackey was one of Daly's pallbearers at his funeral, and in fact, when Daly died, they really hadn't organized a cemetery plot for him, and Mackey allowed Daly's remains to be interred in their family mausoleum until the Daly family built their own. So this guy was a big part of Daly's life. The great story is whether or not Daly knew Mark Twain. And we have at best indirect evidence. They were in the same place at the same time. And then of course when when Mark Twain did his very famous tour of Montana in 1895, he visits Helena, he visits Great Falls, he visits Missoula, he visits Butte, and he works in an extra trip to do a talk in Anaconda. And if you go in the old newspapers and you're looking for what Marcus Daly was up to at the same time, he went to Great Falls after, and you can see when he goes to town and when he comes back to town. Daly was in Anaconda the night that Twain gave his talk, plus Twain stayed at Daly's Hotel Montana. So even though Twain really doesn't say much about Marcus Daly, if anything at all, in his autobiography, I kind of suspect they said howdy. My favorite story, though, about Twain was that he did his first speaking tour in 1866. He had published the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. He had come back to Nevada to talk about his adventures. He had been a little bit of a problem child in Nevada. He was writing fiction before he was writing fiction. His journalism tended to be a little embellished, and he kind of left town with death threats hanging over his head. So he comes back to Nevada, he gives his talk, everything's great, and then he's coming back from the auditorium where he spoke to his hotel, which there was kind of little towns scattered all over, kind of like in Virginia City, Montana. You had a lot of camps scattered up and down the gulch. And all of a sudden, out of the darkness, come 6 armed men. One of them puts a gun to his head. They rob him of everything he owns, his gold watch down to his pencils, and send him on his way. The next morning, one of his friends from his time in Calaveras County pops into his room and says, "Ha ha, we played a great joke on you, didn't we, Samuel?" And gives him back his gold watch and everything else. It was a practical joke. They played rough back then. But there's a legend, which I cannot verify, but it's in the Daly story, that Daly may have been one of the 6 robbers that was part of the practical joke. It would be very fun if he was. And it wouldn't be inconsistent with his character. He had that kind of sense of humor. But also the other connection between Twain and Daly is they both knew Henry Rogers, who was the vice president of Amalgamated Copper and also on the board of directors for Standard Oil. Rogers was a very close friend of Twain's, bailed him out financially, and so there was an Anaconda Company and a Mark Twain connection through Rogers. Daly leaves Nevada. He goes from the Comstock to central Nevada and then heads on to Utah about 1870. He is employed by a famous group of bankers in Utah, the Walker brothers. I love this painting. They're all in order. The oldest one is Samuel Sharp Walker. That was his middle name. The guy standing up because he was kind of the leader of the family. That is Joseph Robinson Walker. They called him Rob. And then we had David Frederick Walker. And then the little brother on the end, they ran out of middle names, so he's Matthew Jr. But so the Walker brothers, they had just begun investing in silver mines. They didn't know the industry particularly well. They needed a knowledgeable superintendent, and they hired Daly to work at their first silver mine called the Emma. Daly gets a lot of silver out of it within about a year, but he notices he just worked the bust in central Nevada. He knew when a silver vein was going to play out, and he told the Walkers, "This one won't last, I'd sell it if I were you." They had some marketing skills. They sold it right at the top of the market. It set off a speculating frenzy. They made about $1 million on the deal, and it was worthless within 2 years after that. So he helped them a great deal, add to their already substantial fortune. They move him over to where they have additional mining properties in, and I think I say this Ophir, I said Ophir, I think it's Ophir. If anybody's from Utah, please set me straight. And here he is put in charge of everything the Walkers own in the area. He also begins to stake some of his own claims. And in my book, I talk a lot about the role of the 1872 mining law and how we begin to be able to document what did he own, when did he own it, by these legal notices for mining claim patents that start to pop up in the Utah newspapers. While in Utah, he meets a priest who helps develop the Holy Cross Hospital, which is now part of the Utah Regional Medical Center. You'll find one thread that goes through Daly's life is an interest in medicine. After he died, Margaret Daly, of course, helped set up the Marcus Daly Memorial Hospital in Hamilton, and we see this thread of interest in things medical throughout Daly's life, and I'd love to know more about that. Also in Utah, he meets this fine young lady. Her father, Zenas Evans, was a lumberman, helped provide timber to hold up the mine shafts and for everything else you use timber for in a mining town, building the houses, sometimes powering steam apparatus. They married in 1872. She was Protestant. I believe that she ultimately was associated with the Episcopal Church in Hamilton. Daly was Catholic, so they had a wedding in the living room of Rob Walker's house in Salt Lake City. The Walkers, by the way, had come to Utah because their father had converted to the Mormon faith in order to get a cheap fare to America. But after they'd lived in Utah for about 10 years, they got fed up. They challenged Brigham Young, he excommunicated them. So they were a very ecumenical family. They were okay with whatever religion you are, we don't care. And it was said that Daly's mother was so ticked off that he married a Protestant girl that she started refusing his remittances and sending them back. I don't know how long that happened, but apparently she was unhappy. And then the first of their 2 children were born in Utah. Meanwhile, George Hearst comes back into the picture. Daly was scouting mining properties for the Walkers. He saw a little hole in the ground near present-day Park City, Utah. They weren't interested. They didn't think it was going to amount to anything, so he told George Hearst to go check it out. Hearst did. He bought it, and the Ontario mine becomes the biggest individual silver mine in the United States by 1881. It helped very much grow Hearst's fortune from a respectable fortune into a very large one. And that will pay off later when Daly comes and looks for partners in the Anaconda Company. R.C. Chambers was Hearst's right-hand man, a good friend of Daly's. Chambers invested in some properties in Butte with Daly, including a bank. So they were fake. And with that, I'm going to keep going. That was my reminder that I better shut up pretty soon or talk a lot faster. We are in Montana. Daly came up to Montana from Utah through Idaho, basically along what today is I-15, except back then it was a dirt road where you had 20 mule teams and 20 oxen teams hauling freight wagons like this. And I use this Charlie Russell, even though it's an image of freight wagons coming up out of Fort Benton. It's a nice image of how stuff got here before there was a railroad. And the answer to that is at 3 miles an hour, trudging along on some pretty sketchy terrain. When Daly gets to Butte in he got there in 1876. I think this image, it says it's 1875. I've seen the same picture where the annotation says 1876, so it's basically Butte looked like this when Daly got there. The Walkers sent him up to take a look at the silver mines up here. They bought a mine called the Alice, as well as several other claims. And the neighborhood that grew up around the Alice mine, up at the top of Butte Hill, is known as Walkerville. So in Butte, he becomes the superintendent of the Alice mine. He settles in Montana, brings up his family. Fairly early on, he makes one of his first strategic mistakes. He teams up with some of the other mine owners and cuts the miners' wages. They go on strike, then form the Butte Working Men's Union. Daly learned to treat his workers a little better thereafter, and I think that's part of why he wound up with a statue at the end. And of course, almost his first day there, he meets the man who becomes his arch nemesis, W.A. Clark. Clark is quite a character. He actually owned a 1/3 interest in the Alice mine. There's a lot of stories about how the Clark-Daly feud began, and it could have been that they both just hated each other on sight. Clark was an Ulster Protestant by descent. He was short, he was fastidious, he had cultural pretensions. Daly was Irish Catholic. He was a large and in charge kind of a character. Of course they were going to hate each other, and it almost was inevitable. But Clark owned a 1/3 share of the Alice, and the property records at the Butte Courthouse show us that Daly officially recorded $3,000 as his consideration for the shares of a guy named Rolla Butcher who owned most of the Alice. 2 or 3 days later, they finally close on the Clark-Larrabee share, 1/3 share, and the consideration recorded in the courthouse was $3,500. So Clark gets an official record that somehow he gets more than twice as much money than Butcher did for this mine, and I kind of wonder if the Clark-Daly feud started pretty much the day they met. This is what the Walkerville area looked like, and you can see the Alice up along the top. It's possible that Daly became familiar with the awareness that there's a lot of timber in western Montana in the wake of the Battle of the Big Hole. And the Big Hole battlefield, when the Nez Perce got into Montana, there was a panic. And the governor sent out a call for volunteers. W.A. Clark gets to head up the Butte militia, declares himself a major. But they didn't need any of that because the Army got there. We had the Battle of the Big Hole. After that, naturally, in those days, they were not concerned about the dead and dispersed warriors and the women and children left behind on the field, but they had to go get those wounded soldiers and bring them up to the hospital in Deer Lodge. To Daly's credit, again, this medical thing, he helped raise money for medical supplies, and it is said that he was one of the people who drove these horse-drawn ambulance wagons that went down to the Big Hole, got the soldiers, brought them up to civilization. This may have been when he met Morgan Evans, who was a rancher near Warm Springs. And Warm Springs, by the way, the first health spa in that area opened up in 1877, so it was kind of a medical place anyway. And that may have been the relief party where he first got this idea that maybe he should build something in the Bitterroot. He also is involved with the horse racing committee in Butte. The people who organized the track started with William Owsley, who was the county road supervisor, owned a livery stable. His livery partner, Henry Valentin, organizes the first racehorse meet. Ultimately, all the people or many of the people on the West Side Racing Association committee become part of the governing committee of Silver Bow County when they split Silver Bow County off from Deer Lodge in 1881. And then the young guy that buys into the same livery stable with Valentin and Owsley is Lee Mantle. And so not only were all of these guys, except for Daly, mayor of Butte, but Mantle, of course, winds up in the US Senate. And so the horse racing connection back then, it's just like people go golfing today, that was where they networked. Daly buys the Anaconda officially in 1880, but he'd also purchased the mine next door, owned by the brother of the guy he bought the Anaconda from, in 1877. So it may have been that he had at least a 1/3 interest as early as 1878. There was a lot of subterfuge in these mining claims. You worked through proxies, you had handshake deals. You didn't record anything at the courthouse until you absolutely had to. So we only know for certain that he bought the Anaconda officially in 1880. In that time, he's already trying to find capital. And the Walker brothers are not interested in the Anaconda. It's, you know, they have an expert who says, yeah, it's got silver, but the silver's going to play out. It's mostly copper down there. Who wants copper? It's a waste product. So he goes to California. He makes 3 trips in 1880, which is, first of all, 100 miles by stagecoach. Then you get on this narrow gauge Utah Northern Railroad. You chug down to Utah. Then you get on the transcontinental line. He does this 3 times in 1880. It's unbelievable. I mean, I don't want to get on an airplane and go to California 3 times in a year. And he's doing it the old-fashioned way. Sells the mine to the Hearst Haven Tennis Syndicate, keeps about a 25% share for himself, and begins to develop the Anaconda as a silver property. Meanwhile, this fellow named Charles Meader is developing copper, and Daly's been watching him pretty closely. Meader was the first guy to try to refine copper in the western United States. He had a reduction facility in Copperopolis, California, Calaveras County, in 1865. He was the first to try it. So Daly knew about Meader. He was watching him. He knew there was copper to get out of the ground, and that this is the guy who knew how to do it. So ultimately, as he's developing the Anaconda and the hole gets deeper, he gets down about 300 feet, and he hits this stuff, which is called calcite. It's a type of copper ore. And at that point in time, he wasn't the only one that hit copper lower down. Everybody was thrilled to see these huge copper reserves. And of course, the nice thing about the timing was that the Utah Northern Railroad finally got to Butte at the tail end of 1881. So they didn't have to use the wagon trains with the oxen to haul copper out of Butte. You had to haul a lot more ore to make any money off of it, and with the railroad they could finally make it profitable. And so with that, we start seeing the empire begin. Hagen helps Daly invest in the smelter. You see the town of Anaconda, 1887. And we see the works back here where they're refining copper. He also develops his ranch in the Butte into the Butte stock farm. And this was an 1892 painting. Not only, of course, is it a romanticized image of 9 mature stallions getting along in perfect harmony, which is kind of fanciful. But this painting, by the way, is in the Mansfield Library at the University of Montana. So if you ever go in the library, you just go to the computer lab, look off to your right, you can't miss it. And there's another painting of the mares in there as well. But here's the fun stuff. If you look at this building here, this is a donut-shaped structure. This was a half-mile racetrack under a roof. And over here, you see some steam coming up. This is the lumber mill. And of course, the timber of the Butte helped shore up the mines of Butte. And so the stock farm became Daly's refuge. It's his home. The stable, this is the carriage house that's still standing on private property. This is another one of his famous racehorses named Montana. And some of the other buildings there. The famous Tammany Hall Stallion Barn still stands today. It's a private home. And again, this was a picture of what it looked like in its prime. You see Tammany right there looking at the camera. And his buddy, another stallion named Hamburg. Daly went all in with the racehorses, and by the end of his life, I think he was spending more time with racehorses than he was with the Anaconda Company, and had he lived, there's probably would be Daly horses we would hear about on the track today. So with that, I'm wrapping up his road to Montana in a very short biography. We have a couple minutes left, not too many, but I can take a couple questions, I think.
You can, but I'm going to ask, because we are recording this, if people would raise your hand and speak into the mic so that people who watch the recording will be able to hear the question. So does anyone have any question? I'll bring you the mic.
Yes.
No, I just want you to speak into the mic.
Okay. Bring me a little bit about Hagen. He's from Eastern continent somewhere.
Hagen was, his grandfather was Turkish. And Hagen was born in Kentucky. So it was his maternal grandfather was Ibrahim Ben Ali. And so Hagen was born in Kentucky, grew up in Kentucky, didn't have a lot of career success in Kentucky, went down to Natchez, Mississippi, did a little better down there. That was a more multi-ethnic community, and then ultimately goes to California. Hagen, he did get called the Sultan. They called him the Turk. They called him the Croesus of California. I think one of the reasons Hagen and Daly got along is because the Irish were a despised minority when Daly got to America, and I think Hagen had his own issues with people who judged him by the color of his skin. He was, that one photograph we have of him as a young man, he's very Middle Eastern looking, so that's what I know. Other questions?
How did you learn how to say those Irish words? Did you practice that?
I say most of them wrong, but the ones I say correctly, I want to do a shout out to Father Patrick Beretta at St. Patrick's Parish over in Butte. He grew up in County Cavan. So that was my connection to Ireland, and he put me in touch with his sister and many of her friends over in Ireland, and I owe those folks big time. And so anybody else, if I'm pronouncing my Irish wrong, please correct me. Yes?
Marcus Daly's funeral was in New York.
Yes.
Where is he buried?
He is buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Yeah, and so yeah, he died in the Hotel Netherlands in New York.
So the funeral's in St. Patrick's Cathedral.
Yeah, I think so. The big one in New York City. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I can't remember. Yes. Yes.
I read your book and it's very good. Thanks for taking the time to. The research is unbelievable. I don't know where you ever found the time.
COVID.
But my question is, it sounded as if this is just part one of a two-part biography, is that correct?
Yes, what I'm going to do is I'm working on the second part. This book ends at 1882 with Hagen's checkbook and the decision to build the Anaconda smelter. The next book will begin in 1883 and take us up through 1900. And so we'll talk about the development of the town of Anaconda. We'll talk about the shenanigans of the Anaconda Company, and all the other fun things that are a little better known than what we cover in this book. Yes.
I also read your book, and it mentioned that in 1898 he had bought the Bonner Mill.
I don't know if I said that in my book.
Oh, you may not have said here, but you did say that he had bought timber from maybe Hammond.
Yes, he and Hammond and some of those other folks were all part of a thing called the Montana Improvement Company.
Yes.
And some of the stuff in 1888 was when the Clark-Daly feud burst out into the open because of some of the shenanigans related to pulling timber out of the public domain without paying for it. And that's going to be one of the things I've got to get into in more detail in my next book, because that's a, wow.
Thank you.
You didn't talk anything about the fight for Helena versus Anaconda.
Well, that's in 1894, so that's going to be the next book.
What did he die of?
The question was, what did he die of?
Well, that was, in 1900, he died of the same thing as his sister Anna. They both died of what the doctors called Bright's disease. And so heart failure, kidney failure, probably linked to diabetes. That's my guess.
How old?
58. And I was 58 when I started out this project, so it was sort of like, my God, this man did so many amazing things in his whole life, and I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. What questions? Anyone else?
Oh,
I have two very quick questions. I stayed at the stock farm a couple weeks ago. Does the family have any residual interest in that?
Okay, you're talking about the stock farm bed and breakfast?
Stock farm's massive resort.
Oh, that one, yes, the massive resort. Yes, that stock farm subdivision, massive resort area there off the east of the East Side Highway, was all part of Daly's property. He had 22,000 acres. He had everything from, there's a road kind of between Corvallis, just a little ways south of Corvallis, that supposedly marks the northern boundary of his original property, and his property extended south almost to Grantsdale, 22,000 acres. I've seen a map, it's huge. So the stock farm subdivision, what happened, I'll give you the very short version of the story. Daly's granddaughter, Margaret Sigray Bessonier, was ultimately wound up owning the stock farm. She was, her mother, Harriet, was Daly's youngest daughter. Harriet married a Hungarian count, and so Margaret was a countess. But they lost everything in World War II, so she comes to America, inherits about a quarter of the stock farm, buys out her cousins, and winds up owning the whole thing. She had no children when she died. Her properties went to her stepchildren. And Francis, her stepson, wound up with the stock farm, and then his sister wound up with Margaret's properties on the East Coast. And Francis is the one who arranged in the 80s to have the Marcus Daly Mansion transferred to the Daly Mansion Preservation Trust and ownership by the state of Montana, in forgiveness for a substantial amount of inheritance tax. And then the family, they still own some property in the Bitterroot, but all of that stock farm subdivision, Francis Bessonier teamed up with Charles Schwab and developed the stock farm. And so,
Schwab's took it.
yeah.
Can you tell me what kind of education he may have had? I'm not sure.
Probably primary school. There's letters, Daly was literate. He could read and write. We have letters he wrote. We have his testimony when he tried to keep W.A. Clark from being seated in the U.S. Senate in 1900, where they take down what he said verbatim, and so you pick up his grammar, which wasn't perfect, but he was literate. Our guess, there's this idea that he was just penniless, illiterate, barefoot, whatever, but it's almost certainly had at least a primary school education. When I was talking with people in Ireland, they made quite a big deal that Irish parents wanted their kids to have some basic literacy, if for no other reason than the British tried to suppress education, and so, there's nothing like banning something to make it popular. So, yeah, we're talking about something that's pretty much primary school education.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Any other last questions? In that case, I will invite you, if you have not yet, to make sure you give us your email address if you want notifications of future program. Brenda will be signing and selling books if you want to get a copy of her book, and please join me in thanking Brenda Wahler.